Welcome to Political Science Podcast. Today's guest is Derekom Edyvaneom, Associate Professor at the School of Politics and International Studies at the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Leeds, United Kingdom. His research interests are broad and include topics such as political liberalism, multiculturalism, political community, civic virtue, toleration, and also different forms of political resistance. But his recent research has focused on the concepts of ordinary citizenship and civility. Also, he's an author of two books, Community and Conflict, The Sources of Liberal Solidarity, which was published in 2007, and Civic Virtue and the Sovereignty of Evil, Public Morality in Uncertain Times, published in 2012. However, the main topic of today's conversation is his forthcoming book, The Politics of Politeness, Citizenship, Civility, and the Democracy of Everyday Life. Derek, welcome to the Political Science Podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Okay, so let's start with an obvious question, which is, how did you become interested in the topic of ordinary citizenship and the politics of politeness and civility?
Well, the thing that really interests me is just how excited everybody is about politeness in everyday life. It's something that we worry about a lot. We're very concerned about being polite and being rude. So earlier this year, New York Magazine published a list of 194 new rules of etiquette for the world post-COVID and in what they described as a multi-front culture war. And then this went viral, and suddenly magazines, newspapers were publishing new codes of etiquette for the time in which we find ourselves. Mm-hmm. And this is stuff that we care about an awful lot. And actually, I think just in everyday life, people care more about politeness and rudeness than they care about justice. Mm-hmm. And I find that really interesting then, because political theorists talk a lot about justice. They don't talk at all really about politeness. Some scholars do, right? So sociologists talk about politeness a lot and manners, and moral philosophers talk a bit about manners, though usually to sort of disparage them relative to morality and the claims of morality. Political theorists don't talk about politeness. They talk about civility, but the first step in most of these arguments is to say, well, there are two kinds of civility. There's what they call polite civility, and then there's political civility. And they say, we're interested in the political bit and not in the polite bit. And so there's just a sort of mismatch for me there, that there's a lot of interest in this in public life and in everyday life, and yet the academics aren't talking about it. And I think that sort of attracts me, and I wanted to explore that.
Great. So specifically interesting part of that I found in your research and in the book, or the outline of the book that you sent me, is the focus on what we could call everyday interactions between citizens. But you emphasize the political character of such everyday interactions. And you give reader a lot of interesting examples how we can understand sort of, we could even say, everyday trivial interactions in a political light. But I was wondering if you can elaborate a bit on the idea that we should look at these everyday interactions in public spaces as, first and foremost, political interactions.
Yeah, so I think the natural thought, and I think this is part of the reason why political theorists don't talk about it, is that this just isn't political. This is just not to do with politics. It's trivial, it's not a political concern. And I think there's a sort of fairly simplistic reason why that can't be quite right. And this is sort of quite a familiar thought, that we know that politeness and manners vary from place to place, from country to country, from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And there are perhaps lots of reasons why that's the case, but I think some of those reasons are political reasons. So the political order under which we live seems to have some impact on politeness and the way we relate to each other in everyday life. I mean, this is something that Alexis de Tocqueville recognizes, right? Yeah. So very concerned about the differences in manners between Europeans living in aristocratic societies and Americans living in democratic societies. And again, there are lots of reasons for that, but Tocqueville's really interested, especially interested, I think, in the contrast between English manners and American manners, because the English and Americans are similar stock, similar language, similar religion, and yet they have very different manners. The English have very elaborate, sophisticated codes of manners, very hierarchical, whereas the Americans, as Tocqueville says, has much simpler, much rougher manners. And Tocqueville says, well, it looks as though this has something to do with the politics. So it seems to matter. So that's a familiar idea, I think, that the politics shapes the way manners look in any given social setting. But then what I want to suggest is that you can also reverse that order of explanation and say that the way we relate to each other, everyday manners, that can also have political impact. And I think one area in which that's quite well grounded is in some of the resistance literature. So I think especially of James C. Scott's work, where he talks about how everyday rudeness, everyday impoliteness and incivility can have potentially very profound political effects. That if it's widespread enough, it can potentially bring an authoritarian regime to its knees. And so I think he's right about that. But then I sort of want to broaden that thesis out and say, well, it's not just sort of everyday low-level bad behavior that can have these political effects. Also, good behavior can have kind of political implications.
Great. And you already mentioned one concept several times, which is the concept of civility. And it seems to be like the core concept in your research. And in one point of the book, or in the forthcoming book, you describe this concept as living together in conflict, right? So can you explain what you mean by that? And what are actually the political implications of the concept of civility?
Okay, so I mean, I've already alluded to this. Something that I think is really interesting about the idea of civility is that it descends from two different conceptual families. It has two different conceptual lineages. And so, on the one hand, the idea of civility descends from cognate notions of the civil, the civilian, the civic. And in that sense, it's very explicitly a political idea. It's a sort of function of citizenship and very intimately bound up with the political order. But then on the other hand, the idea of civility is also associated with the idea of civilization and civilized and uncivilized behavior and even barbarism and savagery. And in that sense, it has much more to do with the way we treat each other in everyday life and in social relationships and politeness and what we generally think of as politeness. And so, as I said, what the political theorists often do is say, well, we're not really interested in the civilizational stuff, we're just interested in the political stuff. But I think what interests me is that civility kind of fuses these two together. So it combines both the problem of sort of just the social problem of living with other people, but it also combines some notion of the political and problems of conflict and disagreement and the sort of things that preoccupy us politically. So when I think about politeness in the book, I want to use the idea of civility in that sense as the sort of framework through which I think about politeness because of the way in which it kind of combines these different ideas.
So what I was wondering is that political theorists have traditionally focused on the concept of toleration. And there was, in recent literature, there is a interest in the concept of civility. So I was just wondering, in your view, what's the core difference between these two concepts? What does the concept of civility do that we think that maybe toleration, as either traditionally understood or in contemporary debates, can't really do?
Yeah, so I mean, they're clearly very closely related. I think of toleration, I mean, the recent literature on toleration is so massive and so complex. It's hard to talk about just toleration as such, but I think of toleration as a more immediately or more sort of essentially political idea. It's more closely tied with sort of the problem of political conflict. And it lacks, I think, civility's emphasis on actually living with other people. So, I mean, the way I talk about it in the book is, look, it's at least on a basic understanding of toleration, you can tolerate somebody by just having nothing to do with them at all, by just avoiding them. That's one way of tolerating people. But you can't be civil towards somebody by having nothing to do with them and ignoring them and never engaging with them. So, I mean, the way one author, Teresa Bejan, puts this is she says that civility is a conversational virtue. So it's a way of living with other people, not necessarily a way of just avoiding conflict with people.
Yeah, that brings us back to this idea of living together in conflict, right? Because in tolerance you can understand the conflict and avoid the escalation of conflict by basically turning back to each other, right? But civility requires something more, right? And just one more clarification. So you understand civility first and foremost as sort of a civic virtue, or something that could also be a normative concept that might be translated in kind of rules of engagement, let's put it that way, within the community, either smaller communities such as universities or even wider community of how we interact with each other in the street in everyday interactions? Or is it just something that we hope that the citizens would internalize as part of the set of virtues that citizens in a modern democracy should have?
So I sort of think it's a bit of both. I think so. We clearly have this idea that there are sort of rules of civility and the terms that people need to follow in order to be polite and in order to sort of do that kind of thing. But I think that can't be all there is to civility. It can't just be a matter of following the rules. So there is quite a prominent strand in the literature that sort of characterizes civility as what they call a communicative virtue. So it's a way of communicating your respect for other people. If you follow the rules of civility, then that shows other people that you respect them. But I think that's a very incomplete account of what civility is. I think of civility in a more kind, almost it's a ritual. It's a social ritual that we follow. It kind of has a ceremonial character to it, and that can take you away from just sort of following the rules. I think sometimes, especially when you encounter someone who sees the rules differently from you, who follows a different set of civility norms, who just understands politeness differently from you, I think actually it might be the case that the civil thing to do, or the civilized thing to do even, is to depart from the rules of civility and to sort of innovate and improvise in order to sort of continue the conversation, as we were saying, with this person with whom you don't actually share an understanding of the rules of civility.
Great. That clarifies things a lot. So I wanted to now to focus on some specific arguments that you develop in your book. In the fourth chapter of the book, you're dealing with a very interesting dilemma, which is, do we speak up when we're facing a public display of what we perceive as injustice? Or do we mind our own business and just keep silent? Now, the author that both of you and I like a lot, Judith Sklar, she condemns non-action of citizens, even when faced with minor infringements of injustice. And she calls this passive injustice. But you have a somewhat different view of this issue. Can you explain what your position is on this issue and the position that you are advocating in the book? It's a bit more, I would say, subtle and a bit more complex than the Sklar's concept of passive injustice.
Yeah, so, I think Sklar was very prescient in this. So, this is in a book she wrote in the late 80s, and she's making this claim that when you sort of encounter an everyday injustice, you have to speak up, and that's what you need to do as a citizen. You need to speak up. And I think nowadays, in the current setting, that's become a very, very sort of fashionable, very popular view that of course you must speak up against microaggressions, against everyday slights and everyday forms of offence. And so what I don't want to say in the chapter is that that's wrong. But I definitely don't want to argue that people shouldn't speak up when they face an injustice, when they see an injustice done of that kind. And I don't want to sort of criticize people who do that, people who speak up. I think there's a lot to admire in that kind of response. What I do want to argue, though, is that it's complex, it's complicated. So what we quite often find in the contemporary sort of public discourse is this idea that it's simple. You just have to speak up. And if you don't speak up, you failed as a citizen in some sense. And I think, well, that's sort of true, but there's a lot more to it than that. And so in the chapter, I talk about 3 different sort of broad sets of reasons why it might be more complicated. And I think, the first 2 of those sets of reasons, I think, are relatively uncontroversial. I think the third is probably pretty controversial. So, first of all, there are just sort of practical considerations. It's difficult to confront injustice. It can be very risky. So the person who you challenge when you confront the injustice might turn around and attack you or something like that. And that's not a reason not to do it, but it seems to factor into our sort of evaluation of people who do or don't speak up. For some people, it can be very difficult to confront injustice. That's especially true if you're a member of a more marginalized or oppressed group. It's relatively easy for privileged people to speak up against injustice, but if you're not in the privileged group, then you're liable to be ignored or just not taken seriously. And so it can be difficult to speak up. I think that's relatively uncontroversial. The other thought I have is that sometimes, just strategically, the best way, if what you're trying to do is confront an injustice, it's not always the case that actually speaking up is the best way of doing that. Again, I suppose there's the thought that if you're a member of the privileged group, sometimes the best thing to do is just to kind of stand back, just defer, let others speak up instead of you, because we've heard enough from these people, and if the privileged people do speak up, they can then sometimes be accused of mansplaining or white-splaining. So there's that sort of thought. And then I have a slightly more elaborate version of that as well, though. I sort of think of the site of injustice as kind of an unfolding drama, and there are different roles to play within that drama. So there's the person who intervenes, but the intervener is just one role. And if they're assuming there are several people there, if everybody intervenes, then it might not work properly. The confrontation might not come off. And so I'm interested in the idea that there are other roles to play. So in the chapter, I talk about the role of the witness. So somebody who doesn't confront the injustice, but who sees it and recognizes it as an injustice, and sort of through looks and gestures can kind of signal to the intervener that, yes, this was an injustice. And yes, I give you sort of permission, social permission to confront it. And I think there are other important roles that aren't necessarily those of intervening, which can help us to confront the injustice. And again, I think that's probably relatively uncontroversial. The controversial reason is the third reason. I also just have the thought that sometimes when an injustice is done, people should just mind their own business, right? It's impolite to intervene whenever you see an injustice and sort of just pile on and get involved. You don't have to do that every time and everywhere in everyday life. And the reason I think that is just, I think there are lots of different values in the public life of a democracy, and justice is one value, but other values are sort of peace, stability, predictability, just sort of quiet and just regularity, I guess, in everyday life. And it's not clear to me that the pursuit of justice should always sort of trump those other values. And it might be that the best way of preserving peace and stability and that kind of ongoingness of life is just to look the other way sometimes and to say, well, we're going to tolerate a bit of injustice in order to realize these other values of public life. But I anticipate some opposition on that. I know that's a contentious idea.
Yeah, and one reason why it might be a contentious idea is if we take your argument and put it in a wider context of debates that are happening today. So, well, one of the, I guess, current debates is regarding the issue of what we could call structural injustice and the way that discriminatory acts in everyday interaction, right, the focus of your research, can actually be perceived as acts of structural injustice. And this debate today is often seen through the context of either culture war or the criticisms of what we could call ideology of wokeism. Now, and here I'm referring to issues such as microaggressions or safe spaces or no platforming or cancel culture, or more broadly, what we call today political correctness or debates on political correctness. So I was wondering, what's your view on this issue? Should democratic societies try and sort of self-regulate behavior that is in some way perceived as exclusionary or discriminatory? Or, following what you said, that the things are a bit more complex than we usually take them to be, there is a line of criticism that says that in some way social regulations, they're self-defeating and would only actually lead to more exclusions and actually be counterproductive because they would not lead to rise in tolerance and acceptance and recognition, but actually in rise in intolerance and political and social polarization.
Yeah, so I unsurprisingly, I think it's a very complex issue, and I don't think there are any easy answers here. And as I said, I don't think that, let's call them the activists who are very keen on sort of social regulation and cancel culture and extirpating injustice wherever we find it. I don't want to say these people have got it wrong. I really don't want to say that. I think there's much to admire in that, but I also think it comes with costs. And yes, the sort of costs you're talking about of it can be counterproductive, it can be self-defeating, but also, as I suggest, there's a choice here, and it creates a particular kind of social atmosphere, a very sort of febrile social atmosphere in which we're always on the lookout for injustice, highly attuned to it and calling it out wherever we find it. And I think there are good things about that atmosphere, but there are also costs. There's loss. There's the loss of the sort of peace and quiet and stability of everyday life. And so I just don't think there is one way of getting this right. And this is it's a larger theme in the chapter and in the book, actually, that we talk a lot about what it is to be a good citizen. And I want to suggest that's just kind of a mythical idea. We can't really make proper sense of the good citizen if the good citizen is somebody who just gets it right every time. Whatever they do, they always do the right thing. I think we sort of go wrong in kind of chasing an ideal of the good citizen, and we do better to think sort of more negatively about just not screwing it up as citizens and avoiding bad citizenship, and actually accepting that it's always going to be a bit messy, and even in getting it right, we're going to sort of get things wrong and incur costs, and nothing's perfect.
One of the topics that you're addressing in your book at the very end of the book is the problem of online interactions, right? Which is logical considering that you are concerned with these everyday interactions, and a lot of our everyday interactions happen online, not anymore in the physical space, but in the digital realm. So there is a question, as you point out, what we could call digital politeness. And although there are some similarities between the everyday interactions of ordinary citizens and the online interactions, you claim that there is an important difference, and maybe these differences outweigh the similarities. Maybe the model of the politics of politeness that you are developing in your forthcoming book can be easily translated to a digital environment. So I was wondering if you can point out what are some of the similarities, but what are the important differences between these two modes of interaction?
Yeah, so, I mean, I'm not sure I want to say that the differences outweigh the similarities, but I think there definitely are differences and difficulties of translating across. I mean, my view is that the street level interactions, the real world interactions, have a kind of primacy, because when we talk about and think about online interactions, we do so by analogy with real world interactions, and we sort of use metaphors from real world interactions when we talk. So we talk about yelling at somebody online or something like that, and you don't actually do that, but this is drawn from the way we think about everyday real world interactions. And so I sort of think we need to get a handle on the everyday interactions before we can think about online interactions. But then having done that, so yes, I think there are similarities and differences. I think there are a lot of similarities in as much as I think just the same sort of dilemmas as we face in everyday life at street level also arise online. So in the book I talk about 4 different sorts of everyday dilemmas. I talk about problems of clashing manners, and clearly you get clashing manners online and people disagree about what the etiquette is or what civility requires in any situation. You also get the case that we've talked about of whether or not you should speak up against an injustice. That clearly happens online. In the book I talk about impoliteness and rudeness and how far we should tolerate impoliteness and rudeness. And of course you get lots of impoliteness and rudeness online, so that question arises there. And in the book I talk about hierarchies, objectionable social hierarchies, and how we should navigate those in everyday life. And again, there are hierarchies online. So the same problems arise, but in addressing those problems there are clearly differences. Well, one reason that I'm quite interested in is that online interactions are global, whereas street-level interactions occur within a specific jurisdiction. So you might be interacting with somebody who's not a fellow citizen on the street, but you're still within the same sort of jurisdiction, same sort of order.
Local context.
Yes, the local context. And that just disappears online. And I don't know what difference that makes, but it clearly is a difference. And so I think that's really interesting. And then sort of, I guess, more familiar ideas about kind of the quasi-anonymity of online interactions and the asynchronous nature. That stuff really has an impact on the kind of dynamic of interactions, which seems to me to make a moral difference. And clearly it encourages trolls and that sort of thing. So there are differences there. But I wonder if some of my broader claims might still go through, that we shouldn't concentrate so much on good citizenship and perfect citizenship online. We should concentrate more on avoiding the worst, the pathologies of citizenship, if you like. And another idea that's going to run through the book, which I'm still sort of developing, is part of what it is to be civilized is to avoid cruelty. I think this is a really interesting feature of the historical discussion of civilized behavior. The savages are always cruel, and to be civilized is to avoid cruelty and prevent cruelty. And I think there's an important lesson for us in that, really, that perhaps what civility is fundamentally about is just trying to be a little bit kinder towards people. And I think the idea of kindness is an interesting one, because again, it's an idea that political theorists don't talk about very much. There's a lot on care, which is a closely related concept. But kindness as sort of the overcoming of cruelty is an interesting idea, and I think it's one that's very closely bound up with civility. And I think a bit more kindness online wouldn't be a terrible thing.
Great. Thanks, Derek. I think we'll be all looking forward to book coming out and reading all about these complex problems as we discussed today. So thank you for being on the Political Science Podcast, and good luck with your further research.
Thank you very much.
Slušali ste Politološki podcast u produkciji Hrvatskog politološkog društva. Urednik, glazba i voditelj Enes Kulenović. Pomoć u realizaciji Višeslav Raos, Krešimir Petković i Leon Cvrtila.